to How to Kill a Buck, where we talk through how to target a mature buck during each phase of the season. And today we're talking about late September, the last 2 weeks of that month. How would we hunt it? I think what we're going to do here is talk through a couple key points and then dive into an example map. We are looking at a property in Missouri. So, Spencer, when you're thinking about hunting late September, what's one key thing that's on your mind?
Yeah, so a lot of states have that late September or early October opener, and if you're someone who likes to scout in the summer, run trail cameras, watch bean fields, that kind of thing, by end of September, most of that intel is meaningless as far as actually killing a deer because they're off their summer patterns. The bachelor groups are broken up, the velvet's gone, food sources are changing, that kind of thing. So trying to use summer patterns to kill a deer at the end of September doesn't help you much. Instead, if you're familiar with a property that you're going to be hunting at that point, try to use lifetime patterns. I killed my biggest buck ever with doing no summer scouting. I came in and sat in a tree stand. It was like the second hunt of the season, September 28th or something. And I just used the lifetime patterns of some deer in that area where they entered the field at the end of September, but it was not the same thing they were doing in the summer. So that's why that time of year, I think if you know your herd from years previous and you take note of what they're doing other years, that's going to help you more than the summertime scouting that year.
And to clarify for folks, I think when you're talking about that lifetime pattern, it's the fact that many times individual bucks will do something similar year after year after year. Mm-hmm. So lots of times a mature buck will move into this little chunk of habitat every September maybe, or every November he tends to start hitting these does first. As you start to learn your property, like you said, you can start to pinpoint those things. Really important. The point I would bring up is sort of a jumping off point from that and the fact that, yes, the summer patterns have changed to a degree. Another thing is changing patterns by late September, too, because you've got some states that open September 1st, you've got some states that open September 15th. Either way, if you're in the back half of that month, there's typically been some hunting that's been going on. Once that hunting season starts, hunting pressure, hunting presences in the woods, it's going to change how deer react. You need to make sure to be able to react with that change. So now I'm starting to think, yeah, they've got this bed to feed pattern that's still to a degree going on, right? Food is still king at this point. In late September, bucks are still traveling from bedding to feeding, back and forth, back and forth. You need to account for how the food sources have changed, though. Find the new food source that's hot, and then find how they're reacting to the human presence. So that might mean you need to get further off the road. That might mean you need to cross a river if you're hunting public land to get to a hard-to-reach spot. I'd be thinking about that at this point.
Yeah, and you know what doesn't change that time of year? Water.
True.
So for me, I'm always thinking about this from pressured ground, so mostly public land. And you talk about the food sources changing and turning over, and maybe the acorns are dropping. The pressure's getting to them. They've gone from velvet to hard antler. There's a lot of things going on. And so for me, that easy food source buck is probably gone. He's probably had enough of the field edge thing, and he's still probably moving in daylight, but he's not coming out into that field. So for me, the two things I look for are water, because they're going to water every day, and you might catch some real hot weather that keeps the hunting pressure down and the deer go to drink. And the other thing I'm looking for is a staging area. So I take that destination food source, and I do this a lot on public land, and I just try to reverse engineer where are they coming from, where's the place that they're most comfortable moving in daylight at this time of the year when the pressure's starting to get to them a little bit. And a lot of times,
just before they go out to the food.
Absolutely. Right? And it's, you'll find a lot of this in early spring or late winter scouting, where you'll find those cluster rubs. You'll find places where if you walk your grounds or you're scouting, you'll see where they could stand, they could kill some time, and they could see or smell that food source, but they're real safe in the cover.
Yep.
And it might be 50 yards, it might be a couple hundred, depending on what kind of cover you're dealing with. But a lot of times they've just taken a step back, and they're not going to give you that easy opportunity.
Yeah. So let's apply some of these ideas to a map here. We've got a property. It's a piece of public land in Missouri. I think you said, Tony, this is 2,000 acres, right?
It's a couple thousand acres, yeah.
And you have not hunted it, but you scouted it.
I have scouted it, yes.
Okay, so Spencer and I are going to take a stab at it first, and then I'm really curious to hear what it actually looks like on the ground. When I look at this, I see a lot of big timber. I see a lot of topography, a lot of just big woods, which always kind of stresses me out, gives me heart palpitations. But what I did see when I started looking through this is there are some obvious food sources, and I'm still thinking obvious food in September. But to your point, I don't want to target the easiest food because I think other hunters have too. So you can see like right here, there's some definite food, there's some definite crop fields, but there's these trails that are so easily, making those food sources so easily accessible. So what I found here was one spot that was about a mile from the nearest parking point. No trails led right to it, where I thought there's a big food source on the neighboring private land. You got a creek that runs here at the bottom, but you could access it from the back, and that creek could be a pretty cool access point, and this might be a staging area. So I thought to myself, you could drive down here, you could hike this trail, leave the trail, drop into the creek, and follow this creek all the way to be close to this food source. I'm hoping this is a bean field maybe. Use this creek to access it. Hopefully there's deer bedding up and around here. I might be able to stay beneath them and get set up on what could be a staging area as they head towards that private land. That was my idea from the get-go. Spencer, where did your head go?
I wish I would have gone first because when I looked at this, I was drawn to the exact same area. And then it crossed my mind. I'm like, well, that worries me because if I'm drawn to that area immediately, everyone else probably is too. But I did like the openings. It seemed like it had the topography that we're looking for. So I was drawn to the creek as well. But just getting in on that creek and then following it and trying to find someplace where it seemed like those deer would be congregated. If I'm showing up there for the first time, I think that'd be a really obvious place to find some good sign as to where these deer are crossing a creek or something. But just far enough off of these fields as well to try to avoid some of that other hunting pressure, because the most obvious places, people are probably going to be sitting on the field edge of whatever that is. I'm assuming some soybeans or something. So in that general area, but off of it enough to avoid some other people.
Yeah. All right, Tony. So you have actually been on this property.
I have.
Do we have anything in line there?
So both plans are decent, I would say, from what I saw. But here's the thing about it.
That's a nice way of saying we know what we're talking about.
When you look at this property, everybody's eye is drawn to that, the fields, right?
Yeah.
And, a creek can be a really good friend of yours for access, like you mentioned. That's one of my go-tos. And so, coming in from this side and crossing this creek and getting in, what I saw, there's some really interesting staging area stuff on the south side of this creek. But
this way.
Yes. And because you think about it and you look at the edge of some of these fields and the easy stuff, and you think, oh, they're just going to stage here. But they've got a massive amount of acorns to eat in here. They've got a lot of browse. They've got a lot of stuff they can do. And for them to walk an extra couple hundred yards is nothing.
Yeah.
And so you just know that the most sign I saw from people is right in this area. And that's just where you're going to be drawn to. So can you back out a second here and I'll show you something. So on a property this size, that's a couple sections, and it's a lot. And like you said, it's timber. So what I did is I broke it down. I like to go down to Missouri and turkey hunt until the 1 o'clock closure, then I go scout. Yeah. And I like to just break it into sections and say, okay, I'm taking the northwest corner first. And I really like to take a look at what's going on the private ground around it to see how those food sources are playing in. So you might see this field over here and think, well, that's too far away to come into play. Yeah. It's not at all. And what I want to do, and what I found was the best looking stuff for me, was these places where you had 40, 80, 120 acres of just timber that could lead to some of these draws that are heading up to those private food sources. And so you're playing off of what's available. And hopefully you can drive around like this one, you can drive around and see what kind of food sources they are. Yep. So you know where to kind of concentrate your search.
Yep.
And you're basically on the opposite side of the property from where everyone else is.
So I'm a contrarian, man. And I love the food source thing, but I hate being around pressure. And when you're on public land, especially if you're in this state that time of year, it's right around the opener. Everybody's gung-ho to get out there, and everybody knows the food source thing. Yeah. Yep. And so you're just going to have company. But it's going to take those deer. I mean, I always think about it like from the perspective of, if you lived in Alaska and you walked out your door and there weren't any brown bears around for 6 months of the year, and you walked out one morning and there's 17 brown bears in your yard, you'd remember that day. And you'd be like, okay, now I'm going to be a little more careful. Yeah. And that's kind of what goes on there, and then you get the small game hunters and stuff out. So it's good thoughts. I mean, the best part, the best takeaway is use that water, use that creek. That is so valuable on so many properties.
Yeah. So I think to sum it up, think about food still, but also realize that pressure is going to change things. So you need to adjust to that. Get out there, hunt, be smart, and I think we'll wrap it up there. The last thing I will say is that if you want more information like this, make sure you're listening to Rut Fresh Radio, which is an episode of the Wired Hunt podcast that comes out each week, in which we break down what's happening in the whitetail woods right now, this week. And then we talk to 4 or 5 hunters across the country about what they've been seeing and what they expect to have happen in the coming days. That's giving you very timely information every week of the hunting season. So check it out, and good luck hunting.